And this is an example of chronic inflammation, chronic specific inflammation, also called chronic granulomatous inflammation. It is representing TB, tuberculosis, in which there is multifocal area of caseous necrosis. These are caseous necrosis, acellular area, and multiple granulomatous reaction. In this slide, the caseous necrosis looks acellular, granular material, acellular granular material. This is acellular granular material surrounded by chronic inflammatory cells, mainly lymphocytes. Also, this is caseous necrosis. This also caseous necrosis. This is also caseous necrosis. And there is multiple Langerhans giant cells. These are the giant cells. This is the giant cell. This is giant cell. These are giant cells. It is called Langerhans giant cells, surrounding the area of fibrosis, and is part of the granulomatous reaction. This is granulomatous reaction, and this is the area of necrosis, and this is the fibroblast proliferation, chronic inflammatory cells, and Langerhans giant cells. This is TB, tuberculosis. Thank you very much. This slide represents acute inflammatory process of the lung tissue. It is called bronchopneumonia, in which there is heavy acute inflammatory cells infiltration of the lung tissue. Most of the alveoli and interstitial tissue and the bronchioles are filled with acute inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils. This is the neutrophilic aggregate. It is also called pus cells. These cells are acute inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophil, within the bronchiole and also within the alveolar spaces. Look like this. These are alveoli and filled with acute inflammatory cells, in addition to some inflammatory cells like lymphocytes, acute and chronic inflammatory cells, neutrophilic aggregates, neutrophil and lymphocyte and histiocytes. These are the pus cells, in addition to many aggregate of the bronchioles with acute pus cells, with acute inflammatory cells, like this. Neutrophilic aggregation. This is bronchopneumonia, multifocal acute inflammatory cells infiltration of the alveolar spaces of bronchioles and interstitium. This is bronchopneumonia. The inflammation is mainly around the bronchioles. This is called acute inflammation of the lung tissue. Thank you. This is also an example of acute inflammation of the lung tissue. This is called lobar pneumonia, in which there is heavy infiltration with acute inflammatory cells involving most of the alveolar spaces, in addition to edematous fluid involving the alveolar spaces. Most of the alveoli are filled with acute inflammatory cells, in addition to exudate. This is the red area or red fluid. This is an exudate. Higher power to demonstrate the acute inflammatory cells. This is higher power. Most of these alveoli are filled with acute inflammatory cells and inflammatory exudate, mainly hemorrhagic fluid. This is an early stage of lobar pneumonia. You know that lobar pneumonia is different from bronchopneumonia. Bronchopneumonia means bilateral inflammation of the lung parenchyma around the bronchioles, while lobar pneumonia, one lobe of the lung is affected. This is an early stage of lobar pneumonia, which is called red habitatization of the lung. Red habitatization of the lung. Fluid, acute inflammatory cells, marked congestion, and heavy infiltration of inflammation. Heavy infiltration of inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils. That is all. Thank you very much. This is an example of acute inflammation of the lung, what's called acute lobar pneumonia. Lobar pneumonia, in which there is heavy infiltration of the alveolar spaces with acute inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils. And this slide, the stage of lobar pneumonia is the latest stage. It is called gray habitatization of the lung parenchyma, in which there is many inflammatory cells with little number of RBCs and many histiocytes, acute inflammatory cells, and little number of the RBCs. Still, the alveolar wall are congested and some RBCs are present, but the main cells are neutrophils and histiocytes. This is gray habitatization of the lung tissue. This is neutrophil. This is histiocytes. And somehow this is RBCs, few RBCs, and the alveolar wall is also congested. This is gray habitatization of the lung tissue. This is an example of acute inflammation. It is called lobar pneumonia. This is a good example of a gray habitatization of the lung, in which there is heavy infiltration of inflammatory cells filling the alveolar spaces with these inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils. These cells are mainly neutrophil, filling the alveolar spaces, means pus cells within the alveolar spaces, and there is little number of RBCs. This is a gray habitatization of the lung, gray habitatization of lobar pneumonia, in which there is heavy acute inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophil and histiocytes, little number of RBCs. The alveolar wall is congested. This is the alveolar wall, and these are the inflammatory cells. This is the alveolar space. This is gray habitatization of the lung tissue. This is the marked infiltration with acute inflammatory cells. These alveolar spaces all are filled with inflammatory cells, pus cells. This is a gray hepatization of the lung tissue. It is different from red hepatization because there is little number of RBCs, while in red hepatization of the lung, there is more congestion, fluid, edematous fluid, many RBCs, and many neutrophils. This is a gray hepatization of the lung tissue. Thank you.